Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining this session. We are very excited and honored to be here today. We've got a very packed session for you and very little time. So without further ado, let's get started. So first, let us quickly introduce ourselves. Well, my name is Asaf. I'm the head of the Nocturnus threat research team at Cybereason. I've been in this industry for a little over 18 years now already. Jesus, time flies. I started my career in military intelligence, and then as a civilian, I've done pretty much anything from penetration testing to reverse engineering, malware analysis, and so on. Daniel, you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm a security researcher at Cybereason Nocturnus team, previously at F5 Networks, and I started my career just a little over than 10 years ago with RSA Security. Now I'm reversing malware and doing threat intel for Cybereason. Yeah, Tom?
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Tom. I'm a threat researcher at the Cybereason Nocturnus team. And before that, I started my Cybereason career at the Israeli Air Force.
Thank you, Tom and Daniel. So today we're going to cover what led us to the discovery of DeadRinger, the challenges that my team faced when we tried to analyze and attribute multiple intrusion sets. And we'll try to wrap up this session, leaving you with some key takeaways and hopefully some food for thought. So you guys ready? So maybe a good place to start our session is by telling you what DeadRinger is and what it is not. So despite the sinister name it has, DeadRinger is not a malware nor a threat actor. And without too many spoilers, DeadRinger is a name that we gave the investigation of multiple intrusions that we detected in Asia targeting telcos. So to start this talk, I want you to come with me back in time to March 2021, probably one of the most dramatic months that our industry had known for the recent years. And why is that? Well, let me give you a quick hint. It starts with Microsoft and ends with Exchange server vulnerabilities. So yeah, and basically on March 2nd, Microsoft, and I believe it was Velocity as well, released the discovery of 4 0 days impacting Microsoft Exchange servers. Microsoft also reported that there was a Chinese threat actor named Hafnium that was exploiting those vulnerabilities in the wild. And now, once the word kind of got out there, basically every threat actor on the planet tried to get their hands on, a working exploit. It kind of looked like this or felt like this. And it took a couple of days and we started seeing a wide range of threat actors actively exploiting these vulnerabilities. As defenders, we immediately started building hunting queries to catch this ginormous tsunami of exploitation attempts. And what do you know? It wasn't too hard to find. We had hundreds of true positive hits. Basically, we started seeing a lot of web shells galore. We had web shells galore, installing anything from APT backdoors to coin miners. Everyone was kind of like riding this crazy wave, going all cowabunga on those poor Exchange servers. And when we started examining the data, we noticed one intrusion that targeted an Asian telco, which had TTPs that were very reminiscent of a Chinese threat actor we discovered back in 2019 called SoftCell. Together with our amazing IR team, we started investigating it. We got in, we pulled around 6 months of data that we took from the environment and started looking at it. Now, when we initially analyzed the data, again, we couldn't shake off this strong deja vu feeling that we've seen this before. We thought we probably found SoftCell again, like a version or like evolution of it. But as time went by, we discovered that there was more to the story, spoiler alert. So let me first maybe show you what it looked like when we poured the data into Maltego. So you're looking at all the machines that we've identified as compromised. Now that's a serious ponage going on here. Most of these machines were critical servers, I don't know, like DC databases, stuff like that. And at the first glance, we thought that it was all part of one giant attack. But remember, we had 6 months of data to analyze. And as we began clustering the data, we noticed that there was not one, but actually 3 distinct clusters. So that was cluster A, B, and C. Now, each cluster had its own unique characteristics, let's call it that way. And if that was enough, they also overlap multiple times, which was once we realized that there's this overlap, we, a zillion questions started sizzling in our curious minds. We started wondering, are the clusters related? Is it the same threat actor? Is it more than one or more than two threat actors? Are they all working together? Are they aware of each other? Are they piggybacking each other maybe? But at this point in time, we didn't even know what these clusters were. We just knew that they seemed very different from each other. And it was really time for us to dive into the data and start to figure out who were we dealing with, basically. So with that in mind, that was like the introduction. I'll hand over the mic to Tom and Daniel, who will walk us through what we actually found in each of these clusters. So Tom, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Asaf. So as Asaf said, we observed 3 distinct clusters of activity. So now in this part, we are going to take you on the journey with us so you can see what we found in each cluster and how we were able to eventually attribute them. So the first indications of malicious activity were multiple web shell executions on IIS and Exchange servers. We saw the attackers spawning shares, trying reconnaissance commands, even trying to move laterally. They did a lot of things. So let's try to break it down to the stages of an attacker's lifecycle. The attacker executed different reconnaissance commands. And as you can maybe see in the picture, the commands have a unique structure to them. This structure belongs to the famous China Chopper web shell, which is very popular with Chinese hackers. And it's also publicly available. So literally anyone can use it. So because of that, it doesn't automatically mean that the attackers were Chinese. Next, the attackers attempted to steal credentials. Now I'll give you a second to guess which tool they used for this. Of course, our beloved Mimikatz tool. Now, the main tool the attackers of cluster A used to create foothold is a malware named PC Share Backdoor. PC Share Backdoor is a malware that was developed also by Chinese hackers, and its code is also available online. So here again, it still does not mean the attackers are necessarily Chinese. In an attempt to avoid detection, the PC Share DLL was sideloaded to a legitimate NVIDIA process. This is a very popular technique used by many threat actors. And during the investigation, we found multiple pieces of evidence suggesting that the threat actor was present from at least 2018. And the scheduled task you see here is just one example of that. Now, with the credentials the attacker stolen, they started to move laterally in the environment, living off the land using tools like WMI. And eventually, they also were trying to exfiltrate incredible amounts of data. The stolen data was moved to a special folder, archived using RAR, and then exfiltrated using a RogueSoft Azure VPN that they brought with them. You can also see at the top the very cheeky password they used to archive the data. So after we analyzed all the data, we built a timeline that shows the attacker's activity. Now, when you look at the timeline, there is something important to consider. We were dealing with a very persistent adaptive threat actor. Not only they've been there for at least 2.5 years before we got there, you can see that when we remediated them, they kept coming back again and again and again. And each time they came back, they modified their tools a little bit and tried to evade detection in more sophisticated ways. And that really shows their great adaptiveness and resourcefulness. Now, this behavior, like Asaf said, was something that we also observed with the SoftCell activity group back in 2019. Now, SoftCell is a Chinese activity group that mainly targets the telecommunication industry for espionage purposes. Now, I'm sure you can all imagine why a nation state would want to hack a telco. Telcos hold so much information about us, with whom we speak, our location every minute of the day, and so on. Then this is very valuable if you want to spy on people. Unfortunately, we are not at liberty to disclose who the attackers were after. But in case you're asking yourself, what would China do with all the information they can get from telcos? Here's an example that was published by Reuters. Now, let's go back to our story. So we compared the data we had from Operation SoftCell with our findings of Cluster A and have a look. When we started to compare all the activity of both operations, we had a lot of data to deal with, which might seem a little overwhelming at the beginning. But when we started to cluster the data and classify the tools and techniques, the connections between the two operations became more apparent to us. And for people who prefer tables, as you can see here, we found quite a few overlaps and similarities in the different TTPs, naming conventions, and targets of both intrusions. Now, one of the things that helped us to cluster the data was using the diamond model of intrusion analysis. This famous model can help us build a kind of an identity card for threat actors. The model describes the relationships between different components, the adversary, of course, the capabilities, which are the different tools and techniques used by the threat actor, the infrastructure, which are the IP addresses, domain names, and such, and the victims, the industries, the regions that are the target of the intrusion. And this really helped us to stay focused on the actual data rather than our own hunches and show us where similarities really existed. And eventually we understood that we are, again, dealing with a soft cell activity group. And we currently classify soft cells as an activity group rather than a threat actor. We believe that they're actually a part of a larger group, and during our research, we encountered some interesting connections between them and the famous APT-41. Our analysis suggested that the group origins in China, and they're operating on behalf of Chinese state interests. We discovered them back in 2018, but we actually found some evidence that suggesting that they're operating since at least 2012. And we've seen the soft cell carrying out different cyber espionage missions on various parts of the world, mostly targeting telcos and collecting information about individuals that are considered to be people of interest to China. Among the targets are politicians, human rights activists, journalists, and so on. So we found our first suspect, soft cell. Now I'll pass the torch to Daniel to talk about the two other clusters and what we found them.
Thank you, Tom. So our story doesn't end with the soft cell cluster. So at first, we did not suspect that another threat actor was actually in the environment. However, as we went deeper into the investigation, something just didn't add up. We could really sense that there was a different team working separately, but we did not know who it was at the time. This cluster had its own TTPs and infrastructure that distinguished it from the soft cell cluster. In addition, among the three clusters, this one is the shortest one, with the earliest indicators going back only to late 2020. Let's have a look at the timeline, okay? The first signs of this cluster's activity were when we detected lateral movement and multiple attempts to dump credentials of various user accounts using the famous combo of sysinternals, procdump, and our beloved Mimikatz. Then we thought we got rid of them, but they came back after a few months. So after a while, these attempts became less frequent. And then we detected a very interesting binary that was found on a few selected high-profile machines that turned out to be an unknown custom keylogger. Shortly after, we detected another suspicious activity that originated from legitimate processes. It turned out that the attackers used a DLL side-loading technique to hide a very rare backdoor called the Nebulae Backdoor inside processes of reputable vendors such as Google and Symantec. Once they mapped out the network and stole credentials, we've seen them on a crazy lateral movement spree, just trying to get to as many machines as they could, and specifically to critical assets. Let's talk about the tools that we discovered that were used in this cluster. The first tool was the InRow Logger, which is a custom keylogger with a very low detection. At the time of the investigation, only 3 AV vendors flagged this file as malicious. Another thing to notice is that the keylogger was actually loaded into a legitimate process as well, this time being Potplayer, which is a popular South Korean media player and can be seen in this process tree. The Nebula Backdoor was the main tool that was used by the attacker in Cluster B. And so it happened that I was the one who got tasked with reversing it during our investigation. So I remember looking at the code and thinking like, wow, this looks quite unique. So of course I thought that I discovered a new malware, yay, you know. Little did I know that the Bitdefender also observed this around the same time and actually beat us to the publication. But you know, hey, that's life, and like really nice work, Bitdefender people. As you already know, this threat actor loves the DLL hijacking technique to hide its payloads in legitimate processes. And you know what's more trusted than an application from Google or Symantec, right? Wink, wink. Like every good backdoor, it possesses all the cool features that can be used for reconnaissance, file and process manipulation, command execution. and privilege escalation, the regular cool stuff. In the interest of time, I'll tell you that based on internal and external intel we had, our prime suspect behind cluster B is the Nikon APT group. So for those of you who are less familiar with the group, it's a group that is attributed to the Chinese military intelligence. They're one of the most elusive APT groups. They're been first identified back in 2012, but there's relatively little publicly available information about them. The group's specialty is cyber espionage and gaining access to critical infrastructure. Their main playground is Asia, although they did target at other regions in the past and also various sectors. One thing I love about CTI work is comparing notes with other researchers. So their observations can be sometimes critical in understanding the broader context of an attack. And what do you know? Just 2 days after our publication, Symantec released a report that had the same TTPs and IOCs we observed in cluster B. And while they did not attribute their findings to a specific actor, they did mention that it was a Chinese threat actor. But more importantly, they provided additional context around the victimology, reporting that this group wasn't attacking just telcos, but they were also attacking various critical infrastructure organizations. Here we can find the diamond model summary for cluster B. As Tom detailed in cluster A, we can see the diamond model representing the capabilities, infrastructure, and victimology found when analyzing what we believe to be the Nikon APT's activity. Sorry. And here we can see the cluster B added to our Venn diagram, including the TTPs found in that cluster. Okay, so we have reached our last but not least cluster, which is also quite an interesting one. So let's have a look. This mini cluster features a very interesting and rare, and again, a rare tool that the attackers used, which is an OWA backdoor. We observed a rather massive deployment of this backdoor on Microsoft Exchange and IIS servers. What's interesting here is that the same backdoor with slight variations here and there was deployed consistently on dozens of servers from 2017 all the way to 2021 without being detected. This really shows us how important it was for the threat, for the attackers to maintain their access and foothold in the network for such a long period of time. This vector has two main purposes. The first is to capture credentials of every user who logs into the server, which means that each time someone checks their email using Outlook, the attackers receive their credentials. Crazy, right? That means the attackers probably were able to get the email credentials of anyone who worked at this company. So whether it's the CEO, head of IT, engineering, and etc., right? Just imagine what an attacker can do with such information. The second purpose is to function as a web shell serving as an access point to the environment. And when we started actually diving into the code of this backdoor, we soon found strong similarities to another backdoor dubbed DLL Shell EXE that appeared in a report by Trend Micro back in 2015 about an operation called Iron Tiger and attributed to a group called Group 3390. Aside from obvious code and style similarities, we also observed very similar capabilities. And if that's not enough, even the log output convention of the collected credentials was almost identical. We can see that the top log structure of this group 3390 tool, is almost exactly the same as our newly found vector from cluster C. And when we take into account all of these variables, actually, the similar code structure and capabilities and similar log file, we arrive at the conclusion that our newly found backdoor was most likely created by the same team who created the backdoor mentioned in Operation Iron Tiger, or at the very least created by an author who had access to the code. As you might have already guessed by now, our prime suspect in this cluster is called Group 3390, which is also tracked by some vendors as a little bit of an easier alias. It's called APT27. And for those that are not entirely familiar with them, it is yet another Chinese APT group, one of the most active and industrious groups that operating is since at least 2010, so long time there. They're conducting mainly cyber espionage, and this group was reportedly attacked various locations and industries. And here's our final cluster's diamond model, which is again quite different and unique than the previous clusters. So now we have identified suspects for all three clusters, and this is time to give the mic back to us.
Thank you, Daniel and Tom. That was an awesome summary of the clusters, like cramming 6 months of investigative work to a very short time. It was challenging. If you want to know more, go check out our blog. It's much more detailed, but I hope we did a good job at summarizing it. Now, we took you today on this journey that started with the discovery of what initially seemed like one giant attack, and showed you how we were able to identify 3 distinct clusters. Each cluster, again, as you've seen, has its own unique TTPs, infrastructure, and IOCs. One thing, though, that really bugged us was the question of the overlap. I'm sure many of you will agree that this overlap is not something that you get to see every day. I'm not saying it's unheard of or anything, but it's just not very common to see 3 different Chinese APT nation-state actors all at once, right? And we were starting to wonder if it meant anything, if at all, right? But in our research, we avoided jumping into conclusion about what this overlap can mean, tempting as it might have been. Instead, we decided to include various hypotheses and plausible explanations and left them as open questions for the community, hoping that maybe one day another researcher will come and maybe be able to shed light on this conundrum. Now, we're getting to the end of this session, or to the last topic of the session, and it's time to discuss the topic of attribution. Now, I know that attribution, it can be a somewhat of a loaded topic. So, I mean, everyone seems to have a very strong opinion about it. And that's why we wanted to share with you the challenges that my team faced and how we eventually, or ultimately, were able to circumvent them, or find creative solutions. So let's unpack this topic for a bit, okay? By first understanding the main challenges with attribution. So perhaps one of the most important things to keep in mind when dealing with attribution is that you kind of have to make peace or accept the fact that you never get to see the full picture. Some pieces of the puzzle will always be missing. And usually this is because of insufficient visibility or missing collection capabilities. So that's one hurdle to pass. Now, let's say that you do have a good collection. The next hurdle is what to do with all of this data once you've obtained it. How do you begin to narrow the data down? How do you determine the relevance? And more importantly, how do you assign meaningful context to the relationship between different data points? Next, it's important to remember that at any given time, there could be several threat actors operating simultaneously, whether it's cybercrime, nation state, or basically anything in between could operate there. So that means that while you're investigating, you are likely to look at a very messy data set with multiple kill chains and multiple threat actors, of course. So it's not like, I don't know, SANS labs or any other training. You'll see usually like real environments tend to get very messy. Now, as an analyst, you'll be faced with questions such as, how do you distinguish between one kill chain to another? Where does one kill chain end and another begins, and so on? And how do you kind of connect the dots? So that was like another hurdle. Another topic that I personally find extremely annoying is the insane amount of aliases that exists both for malware and threat actor names. So you know how every vendor comes up with their own naming convention, and maybe for internal purposes, that's absolutely fine. We even encourage that. But externally, it becomes very hard to track. Now, I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. Let's say APT89, AKA glowing panda, AKA uranium chloride, or something like that, right? So, and also you have to keep in mind that in many cases, these names are not necessarily synonymous. Different teams will have different standards and rules for attribution, and will also observe attacks through different lenses. So you have to be also careful with that. And in addition, some researchers will just hand you their conclusion on a silver platter, like a TLDR version, without explaining too much how they got there. And that lack of transparency makes it very difficult to trust third-party intelligence. So that's also something we need to take into account. And another group of hurdles is that, or something very important to remember about attribution is that it's also very prone to a wide range of biases. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to cover all the different types of biases, but here's maybe, I don't know, a good example, the hindsight bias. And thank you, Taylor Swift, for that great song. So be mindful and get acquainted with the different biases. Another topic which I find fascinating and very close to heart is OPSEC, or the operational security of the threat actors. Sometimes threat actors make silly mistake and leave traces of their identity, kind of like expose who they are while they're doing it. We're all humans, right? We all make mistakes, but you might want to be careful with that as well, and because not all mistakes, quote unquote, are innocent. And sometimes we see what we call intentional sloppiness, or in other words, threat actors will plant false flags to get us sidetracked or send us on a wild goose chase. So that's also an important thing to be mindful of when dealing with attribution. And lastly, you've got to remember that attribution is not an exact science, but it's rather, I guess, a form of art. Attribution is really, like, at least for me, it's about making solid assessments based on the information that is available to you at the time of the analysis. So you got to keep in mind that attribution can change over time. We've seen many cases where it changed as new information emerged. Whew. Okay, so so far we've mentioned the pains of attribution work, but we also want to go over the things that ultimately helped us with attribution over the years. So the first thing is making sure that, So the first thing you want to do is to make sure that you have the right visibility. If you don't have the right visibility, you're probably missing a lot of data, important data, and you should probably make your case to your IT and security teams. Make sure that it gets prioritized so you can get the visibility that you need. The second thing, which I think most blue teamers had to face, is data retention. I think it's the enemy of almost any investigator. So if you do have the possibility to store and then replay old data, that's a great time machine, if you will, and it can help you solve attacks that lasted for months and even years. Next, anyone who ever had to go over thousands lines of logs will tell you how easy it gets to, to lose sight of the bigger picture. It can get really overwhelming. So we found that data visualization really helps us to kind of like zoom out and see the bigger picture. So there are really great solutions and tools out there. We name Multigo, but there's a lot of like free ones. So check them out, see what works for your team. Now, the most important thing perhaps in CTI work is context. So you want to make sure that your team has an update file on the threat actors that are relevant to you, right? So when you go in and you investigate and you support the SOC or the IR people, this will help you to identify threat actors quickly and also distinguish evil from evil, okay? Another thing that I think we mentioned it a couple of slides ago was the trust issues that may arise from consuming third-party intelligence. So a good way to both invoke and gain trust is by being transparent. So don't just share your final conclusion. Instead, try to show how you arrived there. Make sure that your reports are very rich in data and that you separate facts and evidence from assumptions and assessments. Use suggestive language as much as possible if you're not sure about something, or you want to leave some margin for errors, right? That way you can create room for your readership, your readers, to interpret the data on their own, and maybe they would come up with a different conclusion, and that's really okay. But as long as the data is there and it's solid, different people can interpret it differently. And lastly, we highly recommend using the famous diamond model of attribution to cluster incidents, intrusions, and threat actors. This really helps you to stay well grounded in the data and less prone to biases and other mistakes. Okay, so Now, just before we end this session, we'd like to leave you with some key takeaways, okay? So the first one may seem a bit obvious, that threat actors can remain undetected for years, but as we've shown you here earlier, it's not a figure of speech or like a marketing, like exaggerated marketing statement. We literally uncovered activity that lasted for 4 years without being detected. And if it can happen to a company that invests a lot in security, it can happen almost anywhere. So there's also like a teachable and humbling moment here. So don't say, no, it can't happen on my environment. It won't happen to my company, because an advanced threat, they'll find a way to get in and stay stealthy. Second thing you should take into consideration, or I want you to take from this talk, is to learn not to trust circumstantial evidence so much. So if you see malicious activity around the same time frame, same endpoints, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same threat actor, as you've seen here before, right? It could be, but it doesn't automatically say that. Thirdly, we really recommend all blue teams out there to infuse your detection and response methodologies with threat intelligence. So you want to make sure that you know your enemy. You have dossiers on each major threat actors that is relevant to you. You want to focus on behavioral information, TTPs. Of course, complement whatever you can with IOCs, and make sure that that your, I guess, ultimately that your intelligence is actionable. Because if your intelligence is not actionable, you're probably doing it wrong. And lastly, last but not least, once you conclude a major investigation, schedule some time off for your team for a post-mortem. Try to identify gaps that affected your investigation, whether it's collection, detection, response, and then work with the relevant stakeholders to articulate the security requirements that are needed to breach these gaps. So thank you all for honoring us today with your attendance. We'd like to thank the organizers as well for doing such a wonderful job with this conference and for their immense support.